today's Luohan Webinar. It's CJ from Luohan Academy. Today, we're very happy to have Professor Ron Kaniel from University of Rochester to talk about asymmetric information and compensation and the career prospects. So Professor Ron Kaniel is the Professor of Finance at the Simon School of Business, University of Rochester. He has research interests in the areas of asset pricing, financial intermediation, and investment. So in particular, his research focused on the understanding of mutual fund investment decisions and how they impact security prices, and also the impact of endogenous community effects on investment decision and equipment prices, and also the predictive role of change in trading volumes and investors' order flow on security prices. So without further ado, Professor Ron Kaniel, the floor is yours. You will have about 90 minutes. Please take it over. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me over. I know it's a bit late for some of you, so I especially thank you for sort of staying up this late. So this paper is joint with Dmitry Orlov. Dmitry used to be in Rochester. Then due to joint career issues, he had to leave a couple of years ago and has moved to Wisconsin. Okay. So this project actually started as a mutual fund project. What do I mean a mutual fund project? We were thinking about mutual funds, and if you look at the mutual fund literature, there's a fairly large literature on the interaction between investors and funds. But in fact, the fund is not like an individual. The fund is an entity, and the fund actually goes and hires a manager. The clients don't directly interact with this manager. And that's what led us to start thinking about what I'll refer to as sort of double-decker agency. What do I mean double-decker agency? Well, the intermediary or the fund family contract with the investors, and at the same time, the fund family contracts with the fund manager. And in fact, in the first couple of versions of the paper, we're also modeling the investors in a way that's very similar to the way that you have fund investor contracts, and we're optimizing over these investors as well. But as we were thinking about these double-decker settings, we realized eventually that the setting that I'm going to show you is actually much broader than just fund managers. It's going to apply, for example, to lawyers, to consultants, to a lot of settings where they have a few common important features. So the first feature is that these are settings where there's an intermediary. In the case of a fund family, the fund family is the intermediary. The intermediary contracts with the clients, and at the same time employs the agent. Now, there are a few other very important sort of components that are distinguish this setting from other settings. The second important part is that this agent actually has the ability to go and contract directly with the clients. And one question is, why don't they go initially to contract directly with the clients? And the second is, what restrictions does that actually impose on the contracts that the intermediary is going to assume? Now, we're going to look at a setting where there's asymmetric information. So this is a dynamic adverse selection problem. And for simplicity, we're going to assume that the intermediary and the agent, like the accountant and the accounting firm, for example, they have the same knowledge about the agent, and they both know more than the outside, both than the clients. You could argue that maybe we need to sort of incorporate an additional layer where the intermediary might know a little less about the agent than the agent itself. That's a valid sort of argument, but the key insights that I'm going to show you will hold in that setting as well. And that setting is much more complicated in terms of actually solving. In terms of sort of thinking about the real world setting, the key is that the employer and the agent know more about the agent's skill than the outside. Another important feature is that the output is observable. What do you mean the output is observable? For example, in a mutual fund, you observe on a regular basis the performance of the fund. Or if in a law firm, you will see sort of how many successes the law firm has. So the output is observable, and as a result of this observable output, all parties are going to update about the agent's ability. So the agent's ability is going to be unknown to the agent as well. They will have some prior over that sort of ability, and they'll have some signal which the outside does not. But everybody is going to update about the agent's ability. They're going to update at different rates because they know differently about the agent. And the last very important component which distinguishes the professions that we're thinking about is that the output is attributable to the agent. What do you mean the output is attributable to the agent? Well, if I'm an engineer in NASA, even if I'm very senior and I have an important contribution to the project, it's very hard for the outside to say, okay, this part of the project, this specific engineer sort of had a big impact. On the other hand, if you think of a mutual fund manager, even though he has a supporting cast, a lot of the ability is attributable to that manager. And again, the limited transparency is going to be key here in this double-decker setting that we're thinking about. Now, at each point in time, this agent has the ability and go and open their own firm. So for example, in the case of a mutual fund, they can go and open their own fund or their own hedge fund. And we're going to endogenize that decision. So the outside option in this model is actually going to be endogenous and is going to be solved as part of the equilibrium. The fact that the agent can switch directly with the and go work directly with a client, that imposes constraints on the compensation between the intermediary and the agent. Specifically, if you think about the fact that the intermediary knows more about the agent is in the following dilemma. If they go and leave now and open their own firm, they're going to get the outside option. Now, what is the outside option? Again, it's going to be endogenous, but intuitively, the outside option is dependent on what the clients know at this point about the agent. Now, the intermediary knows more about the agent, and as a result, they're going to be able to extract rents because the agent can't really get more than what they get on the outside, and that's going to discipline the contracts that the intermediary is going to give, and that's going to sort of impact what rents the intermediary can extract. Okay. So again, the starting point is the following. The intermediary is going to benefit from, of course, high revenues and low costs. And the advantage of the intermediary in this setting is that the intermediary has more information about the agent than the outside. Okay, so that's the advantage of the intermediary. Now, if you go back a second to the mutual fund setting, which where the paper started with, but it also applies to other settings, there are many restrictions on the contract between the clients and the intermediary. So, there are regulators, for example, in the mutual fund setting, there are regulators, they impose sort of rules on what type of fees mutual funds can charge. But there's very little restriction on the internal contract, on the contract that the fund family gives to the manager. Okay? And this is sort of the contract that we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on the inside contract. Think of this sort of as a black box. Up till now, the mutual fund literature, or generally the literature, has not really opened the black box. And what we're trying to do in this paper is open the black box. There's limited transparency, so clients do not observe the agent's compensation. They can sort of infer what they believe the agent's compensation is, but they don't observe the compensation. Importantly, the clients do observe whether the agent is retained or not. And that's actually going to be a very important sort of signaling mechanism that the intermediary is going to take advantage in maximizing their profits.
Hi, Ron. Can I ask a kind of
Sure.
very broad question? Could you please go back 2 more slides with the picture? Yeah, this one. Yeah, in general, I like your your framework and also agree with your broad discussion or description of the word about this double agency problem. But I think about what if we just think about a very simple interpretation, like the clients, those people have money, but they don't have brain. The intermediary, those people, their specialization is in marketing. They can they have some reputation attracting those the clients and the agents because they have the reputation of being a good marketing person. And the agent, they can only specialize in identifying assets. They don't have the specialization. They don't have the specialization in marketing. So just think about they probably have a different dimension. People just specialize in different things. That's a very simple framework, and it broadly can explain this general this idea. And I want to know what's the the new insight can come out from. Can you try to endogenize those specializations from information perspective and also dynamic adversary selection? Yes.
Yeah, thanks. So a couple of important points. We are not trying to argue here that this is I'll show you is the rationale for why you have this sort of double-decker setting. Okay, so we're taking the double-decker setting as given. We are abstracting from important points that you made that potentially the intermediary might have some skills that are complementary to the skills of the agent, so that together they create something together. I think that's something very interesting. And one thing which I'll touch on a bit later, we're thinking of looking at an extension where we're trying to solve a model where there are sort of multiple types of intermediaries, some of them specializing in what you just pointed out and basically providing, let's say, research services. The key channel that I'm going to highlight in today's presentation is that the intermediary, you can think of the intermediary as a reputation builder. So I'm going to show you that there's value to starting to go working first for the intermediary, because it's an efficient way of building your reputation as an agent, even if the intermediary doesn't have any additional. So in order to really make the results as stark as possible, we're not going to assume that the intermediary has any other skill apart from knowing about the agent's ability. These other important features that you were talking about, I think these are important layers for the big picture, but the key sort of insight that we're trying to show here is this reputation building mechanism that the intermediary is providing. And that's why I'm abstracting from these other aspects. Okay. So there are going to be two environments in this model. One is going to be sort of initially, and the other is going to be a bit later after the agent works for a while. Initially, there's high asymmetric information between the intermediary agent pair and the clients. Now, when there's high asymmetric information, the intermediary can extract a lot of rents. Why? Because all the agents can get if they leave is the outside option. And the outside option, as you'll see, is going to be the value of the lowest quality agent that is still employed. So if you are actually a higher quality, you're not going to be able to take advantage of that when you leave. Now, eventually, your salary might go up when you open up your own fund because people will learn about you. But they learn about you also when you work for the intermediary. So at the initial stage, there's a big, we'll call this sort of information wedge. There's a big wedge. And the intermediary is going to be able to extract all the rents. Why is the intermediary going to be extract all the rents? Because we're going to assume two things. We're going to assume that the intermediary is going to give take it or leave her wage offers. So at each point in time, the intermediary is going to tell the agent, okay, this is the wage I'm willing to give you for this next second. And for the base case, later in the paper, we relax this, but for the base case, we're going to assume that the intermediary has all the bargaining power, okay? In the latter part, we reduce that, and we show that the key sort of qualitative results hold in that setting as well, but it's really sort of clean to show this in the Stark setting. Now, what happens over time? Over time, the outside learns about the agent. Now, the inside also learns. Everybody learns about the agent. But the people on the outside learn faster. Why do they learn faster? Because their initial prior is more dispersed about the agent. They don't have the signal about the agent, so their initial uncertainty about the agent is higher. And as a result, as you see output coming continuously in the model, but sort of multiple times in a general dynamic setting, everybody is learning. And as a result, the asymmetric information wedge starts to decline, even though the revenues are going to increase because the quality of the agent, the perceived quality is going to be higher. The wedge is going to decline, and the profits for the intermediaries are going to start decline. Okay? Now, the intermediary also has an outside option of basically letting go of the agent and hiring a new agent. So at some point, this wedge is going to be small. Now ask yourself, what would you think the intermediary would do when the wedge becomes small? Well, intuitively, I think the gut reaction is to say, well, I'm going to try to slow down the decline, that sort of the pace at which the wedge is shrinking, because that's eating my profits. But what I'll show you is that actually the opposite occurs. When the asymmetric information starts to become small, the intermediary starts to actually fire or letting go agents that to the outside look as high quality agents. The outside don't know that they're low quality agents. Based on their performance up till now, they look like high skilled agents. Now, as a result of letting go of the lowest types, that shrinks actually the information wedge even faster. So you would ask yourself, why does it make sense for the intermediary to shrink the wedge faster if they're making the profit from the wedge? And this is where sort of one of the key insights of the paper comes in. The reason is that by letting go of agents, now the intermediary is able to quote unquote threaten the high quality agents, that they will be let go. And as a result, these agents are going to be willing to get paid less than their outside option. Why are they willing to get paid less than their outside option? Because by staying with the intermediary, their reputation is built faster. And as a result, when they eventually go and open their own business, their own fund, they will actually be able to make much more money because now they have high reputation. So essentially, we show that there are two phases in the employment career. In the first phase, everybody's actually going to get paid the same, and there's going to be very little turnover. Now, when is there going to be turnover? There's going to be turnover if suddenly an agent is found out to be sort of a low quality. But as long as the performance is good, there's no turnover. And then at some point, you start the second phase, which I'll refer to later as churning, where the intermediary churns.
Hi, Ron, I have two additional questions regarding the previous slides. The first one, so regarding the information range, I think in the end, it depends on the IO structure. So here, probably, I assume you assume that only one intermediary, right? So the one intermediary.
In the back end, we actually allow, and if I have time, I'll talk about that. We actually allow for competition between intermediaries. When the agent sort of leaves, there's actually potential competition across the intermediaries.
Okay, yeah, I think because I thought so whether it's take or leave it offer probably does not matter. What really matters is the competition among intermediaries and the competition among agents. If you have kind of the size, how many size of the industry, how many intermediaries you have, how many agents you have, kind of the demand and supply.
So for a fixed set of intermediaries in the industry, I don't think I'll have time in the talk, but we show that the results that I show you basically hold. Okay. Now this literature, you know, as Leanne pointed out, this literature sort of actually touches multiple literatures. It touches, you know, this adverse selection. And specifically, this is a dynamic adverse selection model. It touches the labor markets, touches career concerns. And of course, the starting point of the paper was actually the fund management industry. But now the new version of the paper tries to be sort of very broad in terms of the areas that, employment areas that it covers. So I don't have enough time to sort of get into these papers. I will only say one small point, which I probably won't have enough time to get into in the paper. In the discussion, the dynamic adverse selection problem, we're going to have an endogenous outside option for the agent. And as a result, we're going to get a setting where potentially you have multiplicity. And this is a topic for another paper, which is you can think of sort of as reputation bubbles. But in this dynamic literature, the dynamic adverse selection, you typically do not have multiplicity. So this is, for those of you who are interested in adverse selection, this is sort of an interesting side of the paper that I won't be able to get into in today's talk. So let's quickly talk about the setting. There are going to be three types of agents. There's an intermediary, the agent, and the clients. The intermediary knows more about the agent's ability than the clients. And as I mentioned, for simplicity, the intermediary and the agent are going to know the same. The intermediary sets the wages. So there's a take it or leave it contract offers, and lets go of the agent at some observable time. So the clients see when it lets go of the agent. Now, again, whether you call this firing or the agent leaving is not really sort of material, because the intermediary offers a contract. The agent can stay with that contract if they want to. It's just that the intermediary makes sure that the contract that they offer is such that the agent prefers to go and open their own fund. There are going to be search costs for a new agent. So when the intermediary replaces the agent, it's going to take some time. So delta is going to capture sort of the time that it takes. And there's also going to be some fixed cost. And the intermediary is going to keep on hiring agents sequentially. And importantly, that's going to matter in terms of determining the intermediary's equilibrium value. So the one important feature that we have here, which is also different than many other papers, is that in addition to endogenizing the outside option for the agent, we're actually going to endogenize the equilibrium value of the intermediary. Now, the agent, there are going to be two types of agents. There's going to be 0 and 1. The agents don't know their type, so this is incomplete information. And at the beginning, the agents plus the intermediary are going to get a signal about this type. Now, to make things as stark as possible, we're going to assume that it's costless to sort of start a firm. Okay. All the results hold if there's sort of initial cost to starting your own firm, or if there's initial cost to sort of being an intermediary. Now, in addition to the endogenous outside option that is determined by the fact that this agent can go and work and open their own fund, there's also an exogenous outside option, which is at some point the agent can decide that they're not good at being fund managers and they would just prefer moving to a completely different profession, and that's going to be captured by this exogenous outside option. Now, the client's demand services, for simplicity, they're going to depend on the perceived ability that the clients have about the agent. Okay, so theta is the agent's type. Of course, ET of theta is what the clients believe is the agent's type, given that the performance that they've seen up till now. And A is just a function that maps between their perceptions and how much actually revenues the firm receives. So
Ron, here you assume the agent does not know their types, right?
They will get a signal about their type. They'll get a private signal about their type. The intermediary and the agent will know that signal. The outside will not observe that signal, and they will try to learn. Okay, so even though there are only two types, because the prior distribution over type is going to be continuous, there's actually going to be a continuum of private types. Okay.
So the intermediary and the agent who are more informed regarding the
yes, both of them know the same.
The same, okay,
equally informed, but the outside are less informed. Now, the paper has two versions, one with a Poisson model, the other with a Brownian. The talk, I'll focus on the Poisson model. The main reason is that the intuition is much easier to see with a Poisson model. And then at the end, if I have time, I'll talk a bit about sort of what the Brownian model adds. It adds a lot of complexity in terms of the math, but in terms of sort of what economically it adds, if I have time, I'll sort of discuss that. Okay. So we're going to look at a negative Poisson shock type of model. These models have been used in recent years quite a bit, in part because they're sort of very tractable. So the performance of the agent, there's going to be some drift term, and then there's potentially a negative shock. When the negative shock occurs, then the agent is revealed as a bad type. Now, the arrival intensity of being revealed as a bad type depends on lambda times this term that depends on the agent's type. Now, if the agent's type is a high type, 1, even though they don't know it, but if that is their type, of course, they will never receive a negative Poisson shock. If the agent's type is 0, then with intensity lambda, you're going to receive this Poisson shock. The agent plus the intermediary receive a signal about the agent's type. And for simplicity, we're going to assume that the support of the distribution is finite and continuous. Why continuous? Because we don't want these holes in the middle that are going to potentially create atoms in the distribution. Okay. And as Leanne asked earlier, even though the type is binary, the private types are actually continuous. Now, the filtering problem here is sort of a standard filtering problem for the agent and the intermediary. They are also updating about the agent's type as performance continues. So as long as there hasn't been a negative shock, as long as x equals mu t, this is just the standard Bayesian updating formula that the agent and the intermediary use to find what is the agent's, what they believe the agent's type is as of time lowercase t. Okay. Importantly, the clients don't observe this. Okay. The clients, they're going to infer from observing the performance and understanding the compensation contract, they're going to observe we're going to look at two important statistics that they're going to observe. So first of all, they're going to have beliefs about what is the type of agent that opens their own firm. So this is going to be a process, of course. There's going to be a process that specifies what do I believe about the departing type. Okay. Now in equilibrium, I'll show you that the departing type is going to be the lowest type that is still employed by the intermediary. So this is essentially going to be the lower bound on the types that are still employed by the intermediary. Now, importantly, when the agent opens their own firm, the clients will continue to update about their performance. They will see their performance and they will update about that performance depending on the client's beliefs at the time that the agent left the intermediary. When the agent now is thinking about whether to leave the intermediary or not, they're asking themselves, okay, I am a type P tilde T. The outside believes I'm a type KT. If I now leave the intermediary and open my own fund, what revenues am I going to get over the life of my sort of fund? So what do? They basically solve the following optimization problem. Now, what do I have here? Well, first of all, remember, A is just a revenue function that depends on the perceived type. This agent is leaving the intermediary at time t. When they leave, KT is their perceived type. The outside are just going to use the same Bayesian updating to update about the agent's belief as the agent plus the intermediary used when the agent was employed. So this term here is basically the updating in beliefs that is going to occur along the path that the agent is now working on their own. And at some stopping time, at this eta hat, the agent can decide to, okay, it's no longer profitable for me to actually own my own firm. And again, this is condition. Remember, we're in the event where the agent has already left the intermediary, and I'm just going to take this exogenous outside option. Okay. Now, notice that this outside option, of course, depends on the agent's type, and the outside don't know the agent's type. Okay, so this is where the endogenous outside option comes in. Now, the clients, they're of course going to have beliefs about the agent's type, And QT is basically going to capture what is their belief about the average agent that is still employed by the intermediary. Okay, so notice that there's sort of conditioning here on the agent's type being above the threshold type. And capital Q is going to basically capture sort of what is the average agent's type. Now, what's the profit that the intermediary makes? Well, the intermediary is basically going to benefit from this wedge, this information wedge. Well, KT is the lowest type employed, and Q is the average type employed. Now, the funds allocated to the intermediary are going to depend on the average type employed, but the outside option for the agent is going to depend on the lowest type. And that's where the intermediary is going to sort of make the profits at the initial phase. Okay. Now, what's the equilibrium here?
Yes. Professor Kaniel, before you go to the equilibrium, I have two questions. One is can you go back to the previous slide? So when agent leave the firm and leave the intermediary and set his own firm, is it possible to allow maybe a subgroup of agents to form a firm? This seems like a core in the cooperative game.
So here they won't have an incentive to do that on equilibrium path. And the reason is that when the agent on path, when the agent leaves the firm, the outside will actually correctly perceive his type. So the agents that are going to leave on path, those are agents that P tilde T is actually going to be equal to KT. And in that sense, everybody now knows the same about this agent. So there's no added value to sort of, creating like a cooperative sort of.
Yeah. And another question is, I think the client's demand is pure informational, right? So it pure depends on the perceived belief about agent's ability. Is there any channel to justify or correct this belief afterward by some outcome or some realization?
So I'm not sure that sort of I understand your question, but the clients, when the agent leaves the firm, that's an additional action that the clients will update on when they sort of learn about the agent's belief. Okay, so that they can learn about the agent's belief. Now, in the initial version of the paper, where we just looked at sort of the mutual fund setting, we were also solving for the contract between the clients and the intermediary. So the clients would now set the contract depending on their knowledge. So that you can add that to the model, but it would still be the case that they would condition on sort of the client's ability. Okay, someone is helping me with the marking things on the slides. Okay,
Ron, I have also a related question in the previous slide. So here, the income or the revenue of the fund only is determined by this A function. So I'm probably that will be another change the result. Just think about it. So this A is a function of Q only. So maybe it also depends on how many funds there. It's kind of competition. So it's
so A can depend on the sort of number of funds. In the setting that I'm going to show you, A is not going to sort of depend on the number of funds. Now, A doesn't depend only on sort of the information. It also depends on the contract. So think of, like in the mutual fund setting, the amount of revenue that I'm going to give you is going to depend also on the fees that the family charges. And you can endogenize those fees as well. At the end, we took that out, but you can also endogenize, and competition is also going to impact that A. The only important feature about this A, or the only first order important feature about this A, is that it has to be increasing in the perceived quality. As long as it's increasing, the key results are going to hold. Okay.
What about curvature? Is the curvature important, like convex or concave or this A function?
Yeah, so curvature is going to be important for whether, and I'll get to that later, for whether there's going to be multiple regions where you're going to have this churning. So if you assume sufficient convexity, then you're going to have, like what I have in the slide, you're going to have a stopping time. If now A can be sort of the curve, you can start playing with the curvature, you might have multiple periods of sort of no firing and then firing, no firing and then firing. But the key insight of starting with a quiet period and then churning period, that will always hold. Okay. So what's the equilibrium? The equilibrium is going to define by the following. First of all, the stopping time that the agent leaves and the wage process, W tilde is a wage process, those are optimal for the intermediary. Okay. The intermediary makes this profit while the agent is employed by the intermediary. Remember, the revenues depend on the average quality of that the outside perceives is employed for the intermediary. W hat is the wage that the intermediary is paying the agent, and V is the value that the intermediary gets if they decide to sort of let go of the agent and hire a new agent. Now, importantly, as you can see here sort of in bullet 2, this value, we are actually going to endogenize the intermediary value. Now you might say, why do you need to endogenize the intermediary value? You can show the same insights if the value of the intermediary is exogenous. Well, I'll show you that it's true that the main insights are the same, but there is an important distinction whether V is endogenous or exogenous in terms of the rents that the intermediary can get. And furthermore, because the agent's outside option is endogenous, notice that the intermediary needs to make sure at each point in time that they're compensating the agent, that the expected compensation for the agent of staying with the intermediary, this term that I have here on the left-hand side, is at least as high as the agent's endogenous outside option. Because you have this feature, potentially V is actually going to be, there's going to be multiplicity in V. Okay? And finally, we need belief consistency. So basically the beliefs of the clients about the lowest type and the average type, they of course need to be consistent with all their updating rules. Okay, so let's look at the construction of the equilibrium. So let's start with the first phase where the asymmetric information is high. Okay, now the outside value of the intermediary is V, so you can think of this V as translating it to a flow. R is the discount rate for the intermediary. So the flow outside option for the intermediary is RV. Okay. Now, as long as the profit that the intermediary is making is higher than the outside option at the initial stage, the intermediary is just going to pay the client, the agent, what they could get if they go and open their own firms, and they're going to pocket the difference because the revenue to the intermediary depends on the average type, and the intermediary is paying the agent depending on the lowest type. Okay. Now, on this path, the clients are going to update their belief about the agent, and we show that the way that they update it is basically this is going to be sort of the Poisson adjustment here, and if the agent receives a negative Poisson shock, then everybody learns that this agent is a bad agent. Okay, so when you get the shock, everybody learns that you are type 0, and then no one wants to employ you in this industry because the value of a type 0 is too low to be employed by the industry. Now, what happens over time? Over time, the gap between the lowest type and the average type starts to shrink. Now, even though the revenues are gonna increase, the wedge is going to decrease. Now, it's important to remember in this model, the intermediary is making money not because they have a high quality agent per se. The reason that they're making money is that there's a big wedge between what they know about the client and what the outside knows about the client. So it's all about the asymmetric information. Now, over time, because there's learning, over time, this asymmetric information wedge shrinks. At some point, the profit that the intermediary is making by giving the agent the outside option is less or equal to the intermediary's outside option. Okay. Now, at that point, what is the intermediary going to do? Well, this is where the churning kicks in. Okay. Now, going back to Leanne's question a bit earlier, you see here I have this calligraph T. The reason is that in general, there could be sort of multiple regions of sort of churning, stopping, churning, stopping. But for the presentation, just think of this as a stopping time. So there's up to a certain time, there's no churning. I'm not letting go of good agents. Now, at a point in time, when the wedge is small, when this term here basically gets to equality, what does the intermediary start to do? The intermediary starts to fire agents that did not receive a negative Poisson shock. Given that they did not receive a negative Poisson shock, to the outside world, they look as good as any manager. The key is that the intermediary has more information. They have private information about this agent. By churning, by letting go some of the agents, what is the intermediary doing? Well, first of all, you see this gamma. By letting go of these agents, the intermediary is increasing the lowest type in the pool. Now notice that increasing the lowest type in the pool actually shrinks the information wedge. So you would ask yourself, why am I shrinking this information wedge? Well, the reason is that now I have sort of a threat point to threaten the higher type agents that are still working for me. I'm basically telling them, look, if you don't take a salary discount, I'm going to let you go. And if I let you go, everybody's going to believe you are of type KT, and you're not going to get high revenues. Now, eventually you might, but it's not going to be beneficial for you to leave at this point and have everybody think you are of type KT. So they start increasing the speed of the rise in K. Now, what happens in terms of the wage? Well, this is the reservation wage that they paid earlier and would pay if they weren't churning. Now I have this additional term. This additional term is how much the higher types are willing to pay for reputation. And it includes two components. The first is, of course, the faster the intermediary is churning, the more valuable it is for them to stay a little longer with the intermediary, because when they do eventually decide to go and open their own firm, they're going to be perceived of a higher type. The second part is that for them, different agents with different types have different values for having the outside know that they are higher than KT. And the higher your type, the more valuable this is going to be. Okay. So as a result of this selective retention, the intermediary is basically signaling. The intermediary is a signaling mechanism that signals to the market that, look, I still have the higher quality agents, and these agents will want to be willing to get paid less in order to receive that signal. Okay. Now, higher type agents are going to value reputation more. Why are they going to value reputation more? Why is that? So why is this derivative going to be higher for them? Well, higher type agents know that they will stay longer in the industry. And as a result, any increase in reputation, which is going to translate into increase in revenues, is going to be lasting much longer and is going to be more valuable to them. Okay. This is what people in, the technical term for this is basically single crossing. Okay, so for those of you sort of that know, but it's not, if you're not familiar with the terminology, it's not really important. The intuition here is fairly clear why the higher skilled agents are the ones that are willing to pay for this reputation. So let's look at this sort of graphically for a second. On the left-hand side, I have this retention, this churning function. Okay, notice that initially the intermediary does not churn. So initially, there's a phase where everybody gets paid the same and the intermediary pockets pockets the difference. Think of this as, like when an MBA graduates, many of them, their first job, they get the same salary. Now, does the intermediary believe that everybody that they hired is the same quality? Probably not. But the key is that they don't need to pay them more than their outside option. So at the first couple of years, all these MBAs get paid the same. Then at some point, T star, the intermediary starts to churn. And in fact, over time, the churning rate, we can show analytically in the paper, the churning rate sort of becomes higher and higher over time. Now, what happens in terms of beliefs? So on the right-hand side, again, as a function of T, I've plotted the lowest type, which is KT, and the average type. The dotted and dashed dot lines are what would be the evolution of beliefs had there not been this active churning by the intermediary. Eventually, KT would have converged to QT, but it would have taken a very long time, okay? At T star, the intermediary starts to churn. And in fact, it would have taken an infinite time until the two completely converge. But now, at T star, the intermediary starts to churn. As a result, you see that KT reacts more than QT. The wedge shrinks. And in fact, in finite time, all agents are let go of the intermediary. So the highest type agent, in finite time, they are revealed to be highest type agent. And as a result, in finite time, they go also and open, think of opening their hedge fund. Okay. Now how do we find the churning rate? Well, the churning rate, we just find from matching the equilibrium condition that the outside option for the intermediary exactly equals what they get if they keep employing the agent. And remember, this W here, this omega, is what I showed you here. So all I'm doing is I'm taking this from this slide, I'm plugging it in, a couple of simple steps, and I get the churning rate. Okay. Now let's see what happens to the revenues of the intermediary. Okay, so the revenues of the intermediaries depend on the average type, on capital Q. Now, if I were just to pay throughout the life of the agent, I would just pay them the outside option, this part that depends on KT. This is basically how their sort of compensation path would look. But in fact, what happens is the following. Initially, it follows this compensation path, okay? So everybody gets paid the same. Now, of course, because they haven't received a negative shock, the outside and the inside update their belief about everybody's quality. So over time, the wage does go up. It's not that the wage is flat. The wage of those agents that did not get a negative shock increases over time until you get to this point where the difference between the revenues and the amount of money I need to pay the outside option equals the intermediary's outside option. What happens then? Well, then the intermediary starts to churn. And when the intermediary starts to churn, in order to stay with the intermediary, the agents are willing to actually pay less than the outside option. So let's see how that impacts the profits that the intermediary is going to make. Well, the profits is basically the difference between these two lines. So initially, you see the profits for the intermediary shrink, even though the revenues increase. Why? Because the profits to the intermediary are about the asymmetric information. If I have employing the best fund manager out there, but everybody knows that this guy is great, as an intermediary, I'm not going to be able to make a lot of money out of this. Why? Because his outside option is very high. So over time, it shrinks. But when churning starts, you see that actually the profits to the intermediary are non-monotone. So in fact, when he starts to churn, the pay for reputation by the higher type agents implies that the intermediary's profit actually initially increases till eventually it again starts to starts to decline. So this non-monotonicity, we think, is also an interesting feature of the model.
Hey, Ron,
yes.
in reality, do we have any anecdotal evidence supporting this non-monotone weight?
So
it's hard to imagine, right? The star managers.
Well, think of the following: when you have two things, okay? When you think of periods when there's a downturn, for example, in those periods, the employees will not want to leave, and you could probably extract more rents for them. They will be willing to take sort of salary cuts. Now, regarding the reduction in the high types, I think the right way to do it, even though we didn't model it this way because we really wanted to highlight the key mechanism, is think of a situation where the higher your type, the more bargaining power you have, okay? So if you higher your type, the more bargaining power you have. It's true that at the initial date, everybody's not going to get exactly the same pay, okay? Because now bargaining power is going to differentiate between them. But what happens when you get to the point where you start to churn? When you get to the point where you start to churn, the higher types are going to be willing to get a bigger discount relative to their typical compensation. They're still going to get more than the lower types, but they're going to be willing to sort of give up something in terms of, and I think that is probably sort of observable in the data. Okay?
Yeah, I buy your second one. The first argument, it seems to be a market-wide thing. It's not about specific to that intermediary. It's
right. Yeah. You're right. Yeah.
Professor Kaniel,
yeah.
Whether is it possible that if we have another channel, for example, those very high agents can be promoted to be somewhat like partners and then own some share of the intermediary, therefore in overall that will increase the future value of V. Will that kind of
so that's a good point.
Non-monotone disappear?
So that's a good point. We are now working on extending the model to allow also for promotion. So basically, in order to have promotions, we're going to introduce also a positive shock at the top. Okay, so currently for tractability, we have only negative shocks. We're going to introduce a positive shock at the top. And that actually, it seems that that's going to work, that basically these, once in a while, you're actually going to get promoted. And as a result of these sort of promotion gaps, now it's important to remember that the higher type agents do over the life of sort of over the path, they do receive on average higher fees. Okay, so it's not that as higher wages, it's not that the higher types on average receive lower. It's just that by staying a little longer and willing to give up in the short term, they're going to make that up. They're going to make that up later. Okay, so they're giving up only sort of for a short period of time, and then they sort of their salary becomes higher than it would be had they sort of not given up. Okay.
Thank you. Looking forward to see the extension. Thank you.
So let's think a bit about the value from reputation building. Okay, so what is what fraction of the intermediary's value is actually coming from this reputation building channel? Okay, now remember the intermediary's value is actually determined endogenously here in equilibrium, and now I'm going to show you that is actually going to be important. Okay, so I'm going to define V%. This is the ratio between the reputation rents. What do I mean reputation rents? Notice that what I have here is the difference between the outside option that I would pay and the actual salary that I pay. Okay. Now this part is positive only in the churning region. Before the churning region, this part is 0. Okay. And in the denominator, I have the overall profits for the intermediary across all periods. So the ratio basically captures what fraction of the intermediary value is coming from reputation building. And let's look at, as a function of the asymmetric information, so on the x-axis here, I'm plotting the asymmetric information, between which I'm capturing by looking at the average perceived type and the lowest type. And let's focus a second first on actually on the right-hand side. Okay, the right-hand side shows you when the intermediary starts to churn. The red dashed line is the sort of the equilibrium. The blue line is basically when the last agent is churned, basically when everybody is revealed. Okay. Now, what happens when asymmetry is high? Okay. When the asymmetric information is high, it's going to take a very long time till the gap shrinks. Now, because it's going to take a very long time till the gap shrinks, you see here on the right-hand side that T star, the point at which you start to churn, goes up as the asymmetric information increases. Okay, so this is sort of obvious in some sense. Let's look at the other edge. What happens when asymmetric information is low? Well, and this is where the endogeneity of V kicks in. When the asymmetric information when the agent asymmetric information is low to begin with, the profitability of hiring the next agent, of basically letting go of this agent and hiring a new agent, is also going to be small, because that new agent, I'm going to have a small information gap. And as a result, I am actually going to start churning late as well. So you see, I have this U shape in terms of the churning. Now that translates on the left-hand side to a hump shape in terms of the fraction of revenues to the fraction of profits to the intermediary that are due to churning. You see that when the asymmetric information is high, then I'm not going to churn a lot. It's going to take a very long time for me to churn. So very little value, equilibrium value for the intermediary is coming from churning. And similarly, when the asymmetric information is very low, again, I'm not churning a lot. Very little is coming from churning. In the middle region is where I'm getting what. So when the asymmetric information is not too high and not too low, that's when there's value to the intermediary from generating this churning. Now, what is the dotted black line? The dotted black line is what I would get if I assumed an exogenous outside option value for the intermediary. If I would not endogenize the intermediary's value, accounting for the fact that churning impacts the intermediary's value. Now, when the asymmetric information is high, you get the same thing that I just mentioned. You know, if V is exogenous, but the asymmetric information is high, it's still the case that you are going to wait a long time till you start to churn, because there's a long time where you have high asymmetric information. But the difference comes in actually here. If V now is low, well, if V is low, what does that, if V is exogenous, well, now, if there's little asymmetric information, you have a big incentive to sort of swap to the next manager. Why? Because when you're swapping, you're getting this exogenous V. And you see that this is very different than what you get because of the endogeneity. In fact, if I were to look at the fraction of profits to the intermediary that are due to churning, and I would assume an exogenous variable, I would actually conclude that this should be monotone decreasing in the level of asymmetric information. And by endogenizing the value of V, we actually show you that there's actually an interior solution to this problem. Okay. Now a similar thing happens when you sort of think of persistence. Okay, so if you think about persistence, if persistence is very high in this part, then again, it takes a very long time to reveal someone who's bad, in which case it's going to take a long time till you start to churn. And again, if persistence is low, that's where the disconnect occurs between the endogenous and exogenous outside option for the intermediary. When persistence is low, then the new agent I'm getting this new agent quickly, but he's not worth that much because very quickly he's going to be revealed as potentially being a low type. Okay, so this really shows you that endogenizing the equilibrium value of the intermediary is important in terms of sort of the results. Okay, now one natural question you might ask is, well, I've shown you that the intermediary is a signaling mechanism for the agent. Basically, it's a way to build reputation. Okay. You might say, well, maybe the agent will signal on their own. Maybe it's more efficient for them to actually signal on their own. So we investigate that. What do we do? In the current version in the paper, what we do is the following. We assume that the agent can actually, when they leave, they can offer a discount to the clients. And this discount is going to depend on the perceived type that the clients think they are, and of course on their actual type. Okay. Now, in the version that you see in the paper, we allow them to basically set a fixed beta. Okay, so beta doesn't depend on time. We can sort of expand that and sort of allow beta to vary over time. What's the key complication now? Well, the key complication now is that the outside option, the endogenous outside option for the agent, also now is going to depend on the agent's signaling. But importantly, the fact that the higher type agents will still value reputation more, even accounting for the signaling, we can show that that result holds. So basically the single crossing holds, okay? And as a result, we can basically show that the key insights still hold. And that is, agents will actually always want to start their career working for the intermediary. They will not want to start their career by signaling. It's a less efficient way for them to signal on their own relative to be able to use the intermediary. Now, conceptually, the way to sort of think about it is that the intermediary is basically giving a very powerful signal because he's comparing them to a large set of agents. And if he doesn't let go of them, it's a strong signal that they are of a high type. Now, in equilibrium, we can show that actually there is not going to be signaling using discounts. Now, the intermediary's payoff is going to be lower because this agent has this ability to sort of try to signal. So even though in equilibrium, there's not going to be discounting on path, that does impact, of course, the intermediary's profits. And the intermediary's profits are going to be lower, and they're going to start to churn later. Now, one point that people sort of have asked us in the past that I want to sort of touch on is, how general is this result? Well, right, we've assumed here a fixed discount. So this result is quite general. It will basically hold for any, if I can allow a general signaling sort of mechanism, and it will hold as long as I preclude the following type of contract. If I allow the agent to basically come to the client and tell them, look, I'm not going to pay anything now for a very long time. And after this very long time, you will realize that I'm good, and that's when you'll start to pay me. If you assume that the agent's ability to do that, that will break the result. Now, as long as this agent doesn't have very large amount of personal wealth, personal capital, that they can withstand a very long time of getting paid nothing, then the result will hold. Okay, so in general, the bottom line is that signaling will not help the agent. The best way, agents always prefer to start their careers with the intermediary. The intermediary is basically a reputation building conduit. It's a way to build your reputation. Now, we're not arguing that this is the only reason these intermediate, and this goes back to Leanne's question from the very beginning. these intermediaries might be providing other services. They might be good at research. They might have, resources and so on. But we're really trying to sort of focus on our channel. The next question you might ask is, yes.
Yeah, actually, the mechanism you mentioned is very interesting. If there's any data on the kind of fund managers, maybe we can kind of have a test on this mechanism, right? If the fund manager have a deep pocket or from kind of prestigious background, maybe he or she can afford this type of signaling.
So one channel, yeah. So one challenge in this literature is that it's very hard to actually get data on fund manager compensation. So I actually have a paper using some Swedish data that we have we don't see the contracts, but we see the compensation. But in general, I think that sort of makes it harder to do. That said, I can look at sort of departures, and following sort of your suggestion, one can look at potentially departures and see how correlated these departures, holding all else equal, holding your performance equal, how correlated these departures are with, for example, your sort of initial wealth, if you can sort of get some proxy or for your initial capital. Yeah. So hopefully people will sort of, the empiricists will take this model partially seriously and sort of look at things. Now,
in the alternative signaling mechanism, so the beta thing, is it possible that there should be a threshold for this beta? Because think about rho and beta. If the, for example, the market discount rate rho is smaller than the subjective discount rate beta, then shouldn't be the agent choose to go open his own firm in this case?
So as long, yes. So if indeed we sort of follow your argument and assume that there's a lower bound on this beta, then the results hold in general. You can allow for any type of signaling as long as there's a lower bound on beta. The beta cannot be zero for a very long time, because the issue is that it's true that on a contemporaneous level, you compare to the sort of the market discount rate, but one could argue, well, maybe I'm willing to give a discount for a very long time, to be below sort of water for a very long time, and then recoup it at the end. So as long as beta, there's a minimum, as long as you cannot give your services for free for a very long time, in equilibrium, there's not going to be, we can show that there's not going to be any signal.
Yeah, and the follow-up question about this exercise, if we think about the welfare point of view, if we think of beta as, for example, extra tax or subsidy for those client agents who do individual practice, whether the outcome will be better for the clients overall or
for the clients.
Yeah.
I need to think about that in terms of welfare. You need to be a bit careful here in terms of analyzing welfare, because you could start thinking about, well, if welfare, I should also allow for sort of endogenous entry of intermediaries and so on. So this is something I need to think about. Now, there's this literature on paying for sort of training. And the question is, how does our results relate to this literature on pay for training? So what we've done is we've incorporated into the model the ability for basically to increase the agent's ability. There's a cost function, this C, and it's possible to increase the agent's ability. Now, when is the intermediary going to invest in sort of building the agent's ability? Well, that's going to depend on on two components, on the total benefit of that. The benefit has two parts to it. There's a benefit to the agent itself. If I make the agent better, they're a higher quality, they're going to be able to sort of make more money, whether they work for me or not for me. And there's an impact on the value to the intermediary. Okay. Now, as the intermediary loses their sort of their asymmetric sort of advantage, this second term goes to 0. So in terms of sort of building skill for the agent, they're not getting much value for that. But that's exactly when the reputation building kicks in. So what we can show is that if we now incorporate also sort of pay for training, the wage of the agent now is going to have 3 components. There's going to be the reservation wage. There's going to be a component which is paying for training. So the agent is going to be willing to get paid less because I'm improving their skill. But then there's the third component, which is our component, which is pay for reputation. And interestingly now, the increase in the ability of the lowest type increases the incentives of the agents to pay for reputation. So the bottom line in some sense is that we argue that if you look at, for example, Asimoglu and Pischi, if you go back to their paper, we argue that training, that agents training and improving of the agent quality occurs when the wedge is high, when the information wedge is high. But when the information wedge shrinks, that's when reputation building occurs. So we're arguing that these two sort of are complementary mechanisms that are at play. Okay. Now, touching back on sort of something that I was asked a bit earlier, what happens if you now sort of increase the agent's bargaining power and allow for multiple sort of intermediaries to compete over that agent? We basically show that the quality, and this paper is of course a qualitative paper, it's not a quantitative paper. The qualitative papers, the qualitative results hold. Of course, agent has more bargaining power by being able to search across, across intermediaries. That's going to increase the wage for the agent. That's going to decrease the value for the intermediary. Okay, so that in some sense is not super surprising, but even though and this I think is interesting, even though the compensation that I need to pay the agent is higher, I'm actually going to churn more. So I have about, I guess, 15 minutes or so. So let me sort of briefly touch on.
Right. So before you move on to the next wording, I have a conceptual question here about the interpretation of intermediary and the manager. So I know you kind of treat them as separate, and the manager has the outside option to open its own his own fund. But I'm thinking about how to interpret this. Also about whether this information thing is a first order thing. So when the manager probably initially it can open its own her own fund, but later on when the manager's fund becomes larger, the manager may also want to hire another manager. Right, the manager itself will become the intermediary. So kind of the boundary between the intermediary and the managers is very, very elusive. It's blurry. It's not very clear. So I think so if we agree on that interpretation, so maybe some things about the size of the fund is important, but which is not captured by the current version here. I know as a theory we cannot capture everything. I just want to think about whether this is first order. So now
so I think it really depends here on the application. What do I mean depends on the application? If this is like a law firm, then you go open your own law firm, and when the law firm becomes large, of course you can't do everything. You need to sort of you go and you hire your new ones, and then you become in some sense an intermediary. You were a manager, now you're like a manager intermediary. And I think this is sort of an interesting aspect, but I think you will still get the same. I think the key insight of sort of quiet period and then churning and paying for reputation, you will still get that, but you'll get that also after he opens and becomes an intermediary. Someone else is he's going to take advantage of someone else. Now, there are some settings, for example, mutual funds, where I think depending on the type of fund that you manage, that actually you can scale fairly easily. You don't, if you're managing a certain type of fund and you have a certain algorithm for doing that, even when the fund becomes large, it's true that the overall profits are going to be smaller because of decreasing returns to scale or whatever. But if you just stay in that domain, you don't really need someone else to start, working for you. But I do agree that it is an interesting sort of life cycle question of what happens if you allow them to then, to become the intermediary. And this
maybe in the first stage in the model, so when the managers kind of hang out with an intermediary, the manager also learns about the skill of the intermediary, right? So, that can be incorporated into the outside option choice.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So one limitation of the Poisson model, again, the Poisson model is tractable, and that's a big advantage. One limitation of Poisson model is that the Poisson model doesn't decouple between tenure and performance. So in the Poisson model, there's a one-to-one link between, okay, how much time has passed and what, and how good my performance is. So in order to delink this, we're looking also in the Brownian setting. Okay, so what do? We basically now look at sort of the performance becomes a Brownian motion, and the type now is going to be randomly selected from some normal distribution where the mean of that distribution is sampled from some finite support. Okay, now this introduces, in terms of the filtering becomes inherently non-stationary. It introduces a lot of sort of complications in terms of solving the model, especially with endogenizing the V. Those are sort of technical issues that I don't think are that interesting, so I don't want to sort of get into those aspects. I'll just very quickly touch on a couple of things, okay? Now, as opposed to the Poisson, where you basically have a quiet period and a churning, now because performance varies over time, you're going to have multiple periods of quiet and then churning. Now, when are you going to start to churn? You're going to start to churn after a period of bad performance. So after a period of bad performance, that's when sufficiently bad performance, that's when the intermediary is going to start to churn. And when is now also, as opposed to Poisson, where the asymmetric information wedge declines monotonically, now the asymmetric information wedge can actually vary. Why? Because when you have good performance, asymmetric information is going to increase, and when you have bad performance, asymmetric information is going to decline. And the reason is that the updating about the average type, due to the shocks, is going to be more sensitive than the updating of the lowest type. Okay, and one prediction that we say is that agents that survive the crisis. These are, let's say, and going back to sort of the crisis now, again, you can think of the crisis as a global crisis or just a crisis in that specific industry or that specific firm. If you have an agent that actually withstands the crisis, during the crisis, they will be willing to get paid less. But going forward, overall, we can show that they get compensated, more. Now, the tricky part now is that because we've decoupled between performance and tenure, we have an additional state variable. So now we actually have 3 state variables. You could think that this becomes very complicated, but we can show that the key sort of mechanism where the better agents always care more about reputation, this single crossing will hold, as long as, and here we actually need that the revenue function is weakly convex. Okay, so for this to hold, we need the revenue function to be weakly convex. As long as it's weakly convex, we're gonna get this. And again, the better agents are just exposed for longer. Okay. Now, similar to before, there's going to be a filtering problem. It's a more complicated filtering problem, but again, the agent and the intermediary, they both solve a filtering problem because this is an incomplete information setting for them. They learn about the agent, and at the same time, the outside has expectations about what the average type is and what's the lowest type. So in terms of the intuition, it goes similar to what we had earlier. Same market conditions, still solving V endogenously. The difference is that now we basically have these sort of stopping surfaces. It's no longer a stopping time. It depends both on time and on performance. Now, one result that we show is that over time, in order to not get churned, your performance has to be on average better and better. So it becomes harder and harder not to get churned over time because the threshold increases over time. In terms of the evolution of the lowest type and sort of finding the churning rate, conceptually this is similar, but there's one distinction that I want to point out here. If you notice here, I have capital B and lowercase b. What's capital B? Capital B is this surface that I just showed you that I decide to let go of the manager. What is lowercase b? Lowercase b is actually the threshold that if I'm a manager and work on my own, I might decide to leave the industry. So as opposed to the Poisson setting, where on path, if you start with an intermediary, you never leave the industry until you get a revealed as a bad type. Here, you could be that you've worked a while for yourself, things haven't been great, and as a result, you decide to leave. Now, why does that change the equilibrium a bit? Well, if you're not going to leave the industry, if I let you go, we're in the same situation as before. We have this sort of continuous churning. But what happens if I let you go, you actually leave the industry? Well, now you're not in the region. Some agents may not be in the region where they're willing to pay for reputation. So now I need to actually fire a whole mass of agents. You see this delta doesn't have a delta T next to it. You need to fire a whole mass of agents. And when you do that, you're either going to bring them back to the region where they care about reputation, or you're going to sort of bring them back to the outside the churning region. But except for that, sort of conceptually, things are similar. What's the important takeaway? First of all, wage still exhibits pay for reputation dynamics. After bad performance, agents that survive the crisis are going to be better compensated. Higher skilled agents, again, are going to be willing to sort of pay for reputation, and the performance threshold increases over time. And this is basically what happens when you have this. Now, I don't know how to generate this graph. Dimitri generated this graph. So basically, the shaded areas are areas where you have churning, and you see that you now have multiple sort of periods of quiet and churning, quiet and churning. I don't have much time, so I'll skip that. I'll just point out that because you have this optionality value, when I'm paying for reputation, I'm basically paying for the option to leave later as a higher type agent. And that's why you get this discontinuity here in the wage process, which is similar to what you get in many sort of option pricing type of settings. So this is not sort of unique. It's important to keep in mind that higher type agents are going to be sort of employed longer than higher type agents are going to make, profits, more profits. Those of you who are interested, even to solve this numerically, you need to sort of actually do a trick that allows you to solve this numerically. Otherwise, this is a very hard problem to solve numerically. So one of the contributions, which I haven't highlighted here, but to those of you who are sort of looking at these type of models, we introduce a change of measure that allows us to actually sort of reduce the dimensionality of the problem and allows us to actually solve numerically for the value of the intermediary. So this is just a small sort of point. So let me conclude. So we basically provide here a theory for dynamic contracting under adverse selection. Compensation contracts here we're looking at a setting where there's no commitment. If there was commitment, we can show that the similar results would hold. So this is not about sort of commitment or non-commitment. There are two phases in the employment of the agent. Initially, when asymmetric information is high, the agent suffers a big adverse selection problem because they can just get the outside option. And the threat of the intermediary to fire them when they start the threat of the intermediary to let them go basically means that they will just take their outside option. Over time, the wedge shrinks. The asymmetric information about this manager shrinks. Now, one thing that someone suggested, which we might look into, is what happens if on path the intermediary gets like additional signals about the agent? How is that going to change the contract? I don't think it will change the key sort of two-phase insights. It will have some quantitative implications, I think, as to when you will see churning and the value from churning for the intermediary. But the key insight that we're trying to convey, I think, will follow. When asymmetric information is low, the intermediary starts to churn agents. He lets go of agents that to the outside look exactly the same. They look like great agents, but by letting them go, he's shrinking the gap even faster. But because they're willing to pay for reputation, that's actually profitable for them. So as an outsider, you might say, oh, this is odd. Why is he shrinking? His source of revenue is the gap. Why is he shrinking the gap? Well, he's shrinking the gap because he's able to extract rents from pay for reputation. And what we show is that essentially the intermediary here actually has a role, even if the intermediary, and this is important, even I'm not saying the intermediary doesn't have other skills in the real world. There are other important skills, and Leanne touched on this earlier. The intermediary might have, better research, might be able to sort of facilitate trading, might have a lot of things. But even if the intermediary does not have any of those skills, we show that there's a value to actually having the intermediary as a signaling conduit, and that improves everybody's welfare in the economy. So if you have any other questions, I'll be happy to. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question, Professor Kaniel. First, thanks a lot for this great work. So my question is kind of related to the theme of this webinar series, which is digitization. And we all know that the most prominent feature of digitization is for economists is reducing information asymmetry. For example, we see in China on Alipay, now we can have even a live stream of those fund managers, which creates more channels for those individual managers to send out their signal about their individual ability. And also we see platforms offer freelancer jobs, which create a channel for those individual workers to show their ability and directly contact with those clients. But I think the main takeaway of your work is that the value of intermediary in terms of reputation building is always existing, no matter like how low or how high the information asymmetry is. So this kind of lead to a little bit, at least a contradictory remark for me is that we, on one hand, we see the overall decreasing of information asymmetry. On the other hand, we argue that in a dynamic equilibrium, the value of intermediary, or maybe in a digital world, the value of intermediate transfer to the value of platform always exists in help building those reputations. So I'd like to hear your comment on this.
So I think that's a very good point. I think one of the takeaways is that there's transparency, which has certain values to it. It allows the agents to sort of reveal their type, but there's also value to actually having someone that in some sense can compare agents and tell you, look, I actually see a pool of agents. You're not getting just the information of this one agent. You're actually getting the information of a pool of agents. And in that sense, I think, you know, this touches on this sort of digitization. And it shows that there is some part of it which you cannot fully distribute. You cannot have everything be fully sort of distributed and so that each person sends their own signal. There's actually, even in a digitized sort of world, there is value to having someone that is able to sort of see a set of agents and evaluate those set of agents and tell you, look, these agents are actually the better agents. I saw a pool of agents, and there's a value to the economy at large of actually having these as well in the economy. Yeah.
Thank you. Very thoughtful. Thank you.
Hello.
Yes.
Hi, Kent. This is Long Chen from Luohan Academy. It's very inspiring speech. So I want to follow up on the comment on the digitization. So I think for me, this article shows it's the power of the asymmetric information, which actually spurs business models. But this is what I want to like to comment a bit more on is on it evolves with the digitization of the information. So what I think what you said actually makes a lot of sense, and it's not just about labor talent type, but actually it's very common. For example, in China, you see there's a lot of the startups on the platforms, all kinds of platforms. And now, so most of the startups, obviously, there's a lot of the reputation gap. So their platforms actually, they select certain startups, which they can sell on their platform. So they're very selective. Like I say, Chinese all know this, the Xiaomi is the type. So those startups will grow tremendously because of the channel, distribution channel, and the reputation, the branding, the selection, the signal. So then, it's interesting to see in this process because many of those startup entrepreneurs were my students, and you can see that on one hand, the platform would like the customers only to remember the platforms, the brand. Basically, it's the brand that represents a certain standard. It's the pool, the standard of the pool. On the other hand, when the company a startup grows big enough and is getting a nationwide reputation, it really aspires to leave the platform because the asymmetric information becomes much smaller. So I think it's not just for the labor talent. In general, when the firm grows, it has this dynamic process. That's one thing. Now, another comment I want to make is that nowadays, because of the digitization of the information, there are many ways to actually break the gap of asymmetric information. Obviously, one of the most common way is to have the digitized rating. So all the companies, the customers actually rates the products, the service, or a lot of stuff. So that's one way. So everybody, and so that way, the reputation of those agents or the companies, the sellers on the platform, the reputation will grow. Another way is that through the words of mouth, the digitized words of mouth through the friend circles, this or that. People just, it's like a reputation grows like a virus. A lot of things. So I think that in this way, actually, a lot of the agents they can nowadays they have a lot more opportunities to spread their reputation. Or you can talk about, I think it's like the digitization of the branding, of the reputation, personal charm, whatever you call it. So I think there are many ways now. To me, the story you're talking about is still there. I think it's still very valid, but it's getting interesting that with the digitization of the information, there are many ways to actually break the asymmetric information, and it's dynamic.
So I think it's, one interesting point that you made, which I didn't think about earlier, is that when you think about digitization and you think about sort of digitized ratings and combine this with sort of the branding point that you made, this basically sort of, I think this is an argument for why you actually want quote unquote branding firms that will accept only certain startups, and at the same time actually collect information and ratings about these specific firms and disseminate that information sort of outside, because that essentially is another component of their sort of building the added value that they provide as a branding. These firms are, as you pointed out, they're like branding firms. If you think about like Goldman Sachs, for example, even though it's not about digitization, Goldman Sachs, a big part of Goldman Sachs, it's a branding firm. It basically, when you get hired by Goldman, you get sort of a big signal. So similar, as you pointed out, startups, there are so many that if you don't have someone that actually takes the role of certifying / branding, the signaling is going to be very inefficient. So it's much better for you to be able to get into this branding platform, build your reputation on the branding platform, and then, and as you pointed out, when the information wedge is very, very small at the end, if you have like an amazing startup, at that point, the branding firm can't really extract rents from you. You're going to get paid your market value. That's when you leave. So just like in the model, the high types, when you're revealed at the end to be the high type, at that point, everybody knows you're like the high type. There's no need for the intermediary at that stage, and you leave. But there was value to you along the way for actually becoming the high type by having the intermediary let go of these others, or in the setting, in the digitized setting, having the branding restricted to certain, and maybe even, taking firms out of the platform. So maybe you have firms that initially get onto the platform, and then at some point, the platform says, look, this business, we don't think is valuable enough. We're taking it off the platform.
Yeah, let me follow up on this. I think this is interesting discussion. Let's extend this a little bit. Another interesting business strategy actually is for platform is to promote all kinds of signals, different kinds of pooling. So to make it more concrete, you think about on Alibaba's Taobao.com. So you have basically it has like billions of products. So it's almost impossible for the customers actually to search to find exactly what they are, especially for the startups. So if you really want them, I think important strategy to understand the nature of the value of asymmetric information, that is to provide all kinds of different kind of poolings or different type of products to make it really interesting and make that different variety of the branding. I think it's very crucial for the health of the platform. Otherwise, it's that's the key. So otherwise, it improves the matching. Another thing is that when the platform is too big, then actually it becomes very, very difficult to signal. In that sense, you need to start a different tier of the platform. It's like those really big supermarkets, then you're gonna have a specialized market, things like that. I think it all comes down to the reduce the cost of the perception from the customers. Yeah.
A related point, I think, is if you think about these platforms, they also have like on Amazon, right? You have like a preferred seller label or a preferred Amazon, and that is in part a reputation building for those. If you don't get that label, companies are willing to sort of do things. They're probably willing to sort of give part of the rents Amazon or to Alibaba in order for them to be selected as ones that are sort of specified as like Amazon choice or something like that. And that is a way to, on the one hand, when the system is very, very large, I think the issue is that when the system becomes super large, then the fact that certain firms or certain products were thrown out of the system is not sufficiently observable. It's hard for, because there's so many components, it's hard for you to know, oh, this firm used to be on the platform, now it's not on the platform, and the ones that survived are good. But it is easier for you to label the ones at the top, basically to give sort of the build reputation by labeling the ones at the top, and that is a way of reducing asymmetric information for the clients.
Yeah, so let me add a couple of last sentence. So I think it's so interesting. So if you think about platforms like intermediaries, then the companies on the company agent side, they can compete through variety. So if they have very identical products, it's very hard to compete. Then that's why we see so many new variety of the innovations products coming up every day. Then on the other hand, the intermediary or the platform can add value by provides all kinds of the labeling, as you mentioned. So that's the cool thing that we see every day.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very interesting, the parallels in the digitized world for the.
Hey, Ron, I have given that it's very late for people in China, but I have 3 questions and I try to be brief. The first question is sort of related to Ron's question. I also related to my first question at the beginning of the lecture. I still think about what's the unique feature of intermediary. So you think about them as the kind of advantage of identifying managers. So my first gut reaction is kind of those intermediaries, they have reputation they have better access to clients. So the managers probably, if they are a new guy, no one knows the manager. So you think about the model probably as serious. So those managers, maybe they know their type perfectly. The intermediary does not know their type, but still probably by unraveling. So those managers still want to contract with the intermediary. But the intermediary can access to broader clients. So that the A function is the client, the revenue. But if a manager wants to open a new fund, so the A function becomes kind of smaller, right? It can scale down to reflect that kind of narrow.
Let me just interject one point.
Yeah.
The fact that the A function is the same when you're in the fund and outside, that is just to sort of simplify the model. Okay, so everything works if I have different A functions when I'm inside or outside. Okay, so in terms of this outside A function is going to sort of impact the wage that you can get. And when you're in the region where there's big asymmetric information, everybody's going to get this outside A. So the fact that I'm not saying that there are not different A's. I'm just saying that for the key insights of the model, it's not important. We picked to have the same A just because it simplifies. If you looked at the paper, you saw the math is not that simple. It simplifies the math.
Yeah, I mean, just use that A to reflect the advantage of intermediary. So why those managers want to sign with the intermediary. Yeah.
That's fine. The A can reflect, the A can, the capital A can be different than the little a, and this capital A can reflect the fact that the intermediary is providing also some other services. That's just going to impact the threshold at which agents are going to be let go. It's going to change, the K function, the perceived K. It's going to change that. It's going to change the speed of convergence of asymmetric information, but it's not going to change the qualitative features of the model.
Okay, like now I'm going to ask you a very concrete question. So the public information here, I think it's important for the manager type to be reviewed over time. That will also partly explain the shrink, the decline in the information rate. But the information structure, the public information is very specific, right? Okay, if you have you review the type of your through the public information. I think about this. What if you change that public information and the structure, maybe giving some. So now it's like if you, it's somehow it's like just one-sided. So I think that public information is works against the kind of negative, a low type.
Well, again,
it's not symmetric.
No. So in the Brownian setting, it's actually symmetric. Okay, so in the Poisson,
oh yes, you have the Brownian.
Yes. The Poisson is that indeed it's asymmetric. You get only a negative, but in the Brownian setting, it's actually symmetric. You learn both on the down and both on the up.
Yes, the last one is very broad. So I like the results. I think it's very kind of very elegant, also very rich. But on the other hand, there are a lot of layers, a lot of moving parts in the model, right? Kind of you have the result kind of ex ante very surprising, but after you explain, it's kind of very intuitive. But there are a lot of moving parts. So this is the comment is not about this paper, it's about this literature. So I think about how plausible the story is. So I know it as if argument. So you can, but here in order to think through the manager's problem, those guys have to know how to do calculus, kind of dynamic contracting, all this kind of complex mathematics.
I don't think that the manager needs to sort of do any complicated calculus. The manager just knows that the manager knows two things. When you start your career, if you go outside and try to start as a young fund manager on your own, it's going to take you a long time to build your reputation. If you get hired by Fidelity, that already builds your reputation, and you're going to be willing for a while, even though, like when they hire you, they know that you might be better than the other person that was hired with you at the same time. But you both get the same salary up front. Why? Because you both want to be able to build your reputation. So you start off initially, and then the only thing the manager needs to realize is that they should be willing to give up in the short term to build reputation in the long term.
But how much you give up depends on the competition.
Again, this is not a quantitative paper. So if you argue that, okay, let's calibrate this, then I would say, look, this model, there are a lot of features it doesn't have. To calibrate it, you need to add, just like you pointed out, there's a value that the intermediary has. One extension, for example, and this touches a second on sort of Long Chan's point on the digitization and the different platforms. One extension that we've been thinking of looking at is, because we have this, I didn't have time to talk about this in the talk, but because the outside option is endogenous here, we have multiplicity in equilibrium. And because of this potential multiplicity in equilibrium, you don't always have it. So you have it only if the search costs are very low. But putting that aside, because you have this multiplicity, you can now think of an equilibrium across intermediaries, across these digitized platforms, where some platforms specialize in building reputation and other platforms specialize in providing sort of services to the to the firms that are using them. And in equilibrium, both of them are going to actually, so what we argue is that both of them can potentially coexist in equilibrium. And hopefully we'll be able to show this, and we've been starting to think about this as a follow-up paper of basically these, again, in the digitized setting, think of these as sort of different platforms that specialize. One of them specializes in this building reputation, and the other maybe specializes in assisting sort of young entrepreneurs. In equilibrium, they can both exist.
Yes, let's discuss it later, given this is a very late for
Yeah, I think some
Chinese
people for
audience.
them it's
Yeah.
like super late. Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks, Professor Kaniel. Is there any additional questions? Yes, then I guess we can conclude here. Thanks again. It's very interesting. I
Thank
hope
you.
to see you again in your future webinar.
Great. Thanks a lot. Thanks, guys, for having me.
Bye bye.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you.